Well, welcome everybody. Before we begin, I've got a few details for you. This session is being recorded. We'll have time at the end for some Q&A, and if you have questions, just use the chat function, and Professor Diamond will answer as many of your questions as he has time for. Again, welcome. I'm Linda Paulson, the Associate Dean and Director of the Master of Liberal Arts program. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the MLA program to tonight's conversation about how to repair American democracy. I'm happy first and foremost to introduce Professor Larry Diamond. Larry is a senior fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, a professor by courtesy of political science and sociology. He's also the former director of Stanford's Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's the author of many books and articles, all of which feature the word democracy in their titles. I can't think of anyone whose voice we more need to hear just now, and on an issue that's vital to us and to the country as we recover from a brutal election season. When in October, I asked Larry if he would come and talk to us, we didn't know where we would be on December 2nd. Well, now we've come to December and we have some important answers, but a lot of lingering unanswered questions. I'm happy to turn this over to Professor Larry Diamond, who can help us think about where we are and what we can anticipate. Larry.
Okay, well, thank you, Linda, and hello to all of you, and apologies for the delay in joining you in this really COVID crazy era. I knew when you asked, Linda, the one thing I knew is I would be sitting here in the den of my home on campus, but I'm sitting here a little bit more hopeful about American democracy than I might have been if the worst fears about the 2020 election, which would be that there would be an effort to basically steal the vote in the Electoral College that would be successful, as opposed to the unsuccessful effort we now have, had materialized. I have been developing for a while an analysis of the plight we're in. And I think it heavily, but not exclusively, revolves around a curse of our politics that, interestingly, is not unique to the United States. And here I bring the experience I have in studying democracy comparatively around the world. It's a phenomenon that afflicts now really many of our peer democracies and the advanced liberal democracies of the world, and many other emerging democracies, and that is the curse of intense partisan polarization. So I want to share some slides that I have for this lecture. They're a little bit political sciencey at times, but not too much. If I go through them a little bit quickly for you, I'll be happy to share them with anybody who wants them. And obviously, I will welcome all your questions, comments, disagreements, suggestions. Let's begin with this problem of how we repair the acute political polarization that has fractured our Congress and fractured our democracy. I think much of the problem, certainly with polarization, that we are dealing with in the United States can be summarized in these assertions, which I have from my undergraduate course on democracy, a lot of data to back up, but I don't have the time to share the data with you tonight. The Congress has become much more ideologically polarized and much more separated along partisan lines, and the two political parties have become much more ideologically sorted in the Congress than they used to be. And as a result of that, and changes in political strategy and tactics, and the rise of new kinds of media, we now have a zero-sum struggle where it's very difficult to find compromise. And whenever one faction of the Congress or one president is seen to be successful, the other side treats it as inevitably a failure for itself. And we're seeing that now play out in the effort on the relief bill to address the COVID pandemic, where a group of moderate senators, Republican and Democrat, people like Susan Collins and Angus King from the two sides of the aisle in Maine have reached agreement on a COVID relief package of something like $900 billion. And Mitch McConnell says it's too much. And Nancy Pelosi says it's too little. And in my view, it probably is too little. But you take what you can get in political life, particularly when people are hurting and food lines are so long that you can't even see the end of them in the car lines in many American cities. Anyway, we have what we are witnessing now on Capitol Hill at this moment: congressional deadlock and stalemate. Why is this? Well, the people have become themselves as a society more polarized, but they're not as polarized as the Congress. And I think there is a reason for this that political scientists may not have converged on as the only answer, but I think they've converged on it as an important part of the answer. And that is that we nominate our candidates these days, as we have for many decades, in party primaries. But increasingly, party primaries are low turnout, highly ideological, intensely polarized affairs, where the people who are most likely to turn out to vote in party primary elections that take place many months before the general election are the most intensely ideological voters. They're the most highly committed. They're the ones who are most likely to vote, who give the most money, who walk the precincts and campaign for candidates. And so if the party primaries are disproportionately influenced by highly ideological voters and contributors, then the people who are getting nominated by the Republican Party, and I think there's a growing tendency in the Democratic Party, though the degree of ideological polarization is not symmetrical between the two parties, are candidates who are further to the right and further to the left. And if that's the only realistic alternative that voters are presented with, we wind up with an ever more polarized politics and Congress. So that's the nexus of dysfunction and perverse incentives that we need to address. These are the drivers, the elements, in my view, of the polarizing formula. A political party system that's dominated by only two political parties. If you vote for any other party, and usually if you vote for an independent, in our system of first past the post in single member districts, that is plurality election in a single member district, and whoever gets the most votes wins. If you vote for anybody else other than D or R, you're just completely wasting your vote. And again, candidates are nominated in low turnout primary elections. And moreover, most people are unaware of this. In about 45 of the states in the United States, we have something called the sore loser rule. That means that, if you lose a party primary, maybe because you were a moderate incumbent who got targeted by a more extreme ideological candidate in the party primary, if you lose your party primary, you are not allowed to be on the ballot in the general election. And so once you have more polarizing candidates who win the party primaries, they're the ones who face off in the general election. And of course, we have the additional phenomenon, which requires not just a lecture, but a week in itself, of social media as a venue for a driver of, a magnifier of partisan intensity, suspicion, rumor mongering, disinformation, and inflammation. So this is my reform agenda. I don't know if I'll get to every one of these 11 elements, but this is my 12-step program because, you know, when I give you an 11-step program like this, I cheat. And my 12th step is to repeat the 11 steps again, ever more passionately.
Larry,
Yeah.
can you hear me? Could you get into presentation mode?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I wish you'd told me that earlier. So these are the 11 steps that I think would go a long ways toward improving our democracy. Nothing is a magic wand. And a lot of this, you know, I keep saying requires humility, both on the part of political scientists like myself and on the part of reform organizations to understand that it's not always fully possible to anticipate how a reform that looks good in the abstract is going to work in reality. And here I think with all the frustrations we have about, you know, the decentralization of American politics and the difficulty of getting national level reforms, it does present some opportunities for experimentation in the different states. So my reform number one, I have a number of friends I see on this large Zoom gathering who I have talked to on Stanford travel study trips and who've been on the receiving end or of one or another of my rants about this, so they've heard this before. But it's still the case that my number one reform to change the polarizing incentive structures is ranked choice voting, and I'll come back to that. I think if you combine ranked choice voting, more choice in elections, the instant runoff, with an end to the sore loser rule, it would mean that if a moderate candidate lost a party primary, they'd still be able to come back and run as an independent in the general election and give voters more choice and maybe an option or a pathway away from polarization. Obviously, I hope it's obvious to you, we need to expand the opportunity to vote, stop the suppression of the vote, and this means reintroducing and invigorating the Voting Rights Act of 1965, really enforcing, restrictions against making it more difficult for people to vote on the basis of race. I can't even believe that in the year 2020, we're still having to have this conversation after all the history we have in the United States. And I believe it's time, as we just did in the state of California, to give convicted felons who've served their time the right to return to full citizenship and vote. I'll explain not so much why we should eliminate the Electoral College. I think that's clear to a growing number of Americans, but some options by which we might do so. Some ways to at least modestly address the problem of campaign finance. And there are three others I hope I can get to in this conversation. Strengthening election security and administration, which interestingly, we made enormous gains on in 2020. Reforming the Congress so one man can't block compromise in the United States, one 78-year-old man who's been there for 35 years, and depoliticizing the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's start with electoral reform. Ranked choice voting, I think, gives us the best purchase on trying to diminish, not magically eliminate, but diminish political polarization. First, let's understand what it is, and then we can talk about how it does so. So under ranked choice voting, let's assume we keep the system of electing legislators from single member districts, or electing obviously a governor or an attorney general of a state or whatever. But instead of only voting for one candidate, we do what the voters of San Francisco do, of Berkeley, of Oakland, of Bloomington, Minnesota, of Portland, Maine, indeed of the entire state of Maine now. And we let voters rank their candidates 1, 2, 3, 4. And under this system, if no candidate gets a majority of first preference votes, the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes in this hypothetical illustration, candidate E, is eliminated. And their votes, candidate E's votes, are distributed to the second preference candidates of candidate E's voters. Then once again, you see if somebody has a majority of first preference votes. And if not, the lowest ranking candidate is eliminated at that point until somebody emerges with a majority of the vote, or all of the ballots are exhausted. So someone has a majority of the remaining ballots in this instant runoff process. Now, the knock against ranked choice voting, there are several. One is it makes it possible for a candidate who didn't win a majority of first preference votes to win the election. But in a way, that's the whole point, that if you give people more choice and more control over the ballot and ask them to consider, not only their first preference, but, who they might be most wary of. So which candidate, can appeal to the broadest segment of the electorate, it creates more interest in the election. It makes it more difficult for highly polarizing candidates to win because they have to get a majority of all the votes cast. And so this system is beginning to appeal to more and more people. Ranked choice voting does some interesting things. It ends the spoiler problem because there are no wasted votes. If nobody gets a majority of first preference ballots, you haven't wasted your vote by voting for an independent or a libertarian or a Green Party candidate or whoever it might be. Your vote will be distributed to your next choice if your first choice was the least popular on the first preferences. So it encourages broad coalition formation. It produces majority winners. And, it's had, research tells us, by looking at the way it's been employed in municipal elections, another felicitous byproduct. It reduces negative campaigning and makes campaigns, in the perception of voters who've experienced it, less negative. Because if you've got several opponents and you want to appeal for some of their second preference votes, it's harder to go negative on your opponents because you will maybe dirty up the person you see as your primary competitor, but you'll impugn your own integrity as well by running that kind of campaign and maybe make it more difficult to attract second preference votes. So for all these reasons, it seems to have some interesting potential to reduce polarization. And when you combine it with ending the sore loser rule, I really like the traction this might generate by enabling a moderate candidate. Think of a Lisa Murkowski, or maybe a moderate Democrat like Bennett of Colorado or Manchin of West Virginia. If they were to be defeated in a low turnout party primary, they could come back and run as an independent in the general election. And a lot of people in the middle, independents, Republicans, Democrats, might vote for them. They might win. So another way that this can be done is with what we call the blanket primary. Now, California, you'll recall, about 10 years ago, adopted the blanket primary. It's sometimes called, I don't like this term, the jungle primary. That means that everybody struggles against everybody else. There is no party primary, but the first round is merged. And in California, the top two candidates go on to the general election. It was thought, well, maybe you'd get two Democrats running against one another, two Republicans. You'd choose the more moderate one. It hasn't really worked out this way. And I, in principle, don't like the phenomenon of holding a party primary in June and narrowing the field to only two candidates and then not allowing anybody else to run in the fall. Alaska, on November 3rd, became the second state in the union after Maine to adopt ranked choice voting. And they adopted a form of it that's attracting growing interest among political reformers in the United States. And it's called the top four primary. So in this system, voters are able to choose their favorite candidate to advance to the general election. And the candidates that finish in the top four positions in terms of the popular vote then go on to the general election. Could be two Democrats, a Republican, and an independent, or vice versa, or who knows? Maybe a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, and a libertarian. And then ranked choice voting is used to select among the top four. There's a reform initiative underway to adopt top five, but something like that. And so this is now going to be an experiment in our federal system to see if maybe this might be a way of encouraging depolarization. And very interestingly, Lisa Murkowski, who is one of the two most moderate members of the Republican caucus in the Senate, and who already faced a brutal primary challenge 10 years ago that she lost and required her to barely win re-election as a write-in candidate. Lisa Murkowski will be running for re-election in Alaska in 2022. This system is tailor-made for Lisa Murkowski because she doesn't have to fear so much losing a Republican primary to a more extreme candidate. If she doesn't finish first in the primary, maybe she'll finish second or third and meet the candidates again with ranked choice voting in the general election. Now let's go on to districting and redistricting, and another problem with our elections. Here you see, as a result of gerrymandering and the disproportionality that is introduced by the natural fact that Democrats tend to cluster in cities where they're highly concentrated and don't efficiently use their votes because cities might be 70 or 80% Democratic. And so if you concentrate Democrats in cities or hypercharge the concentration with gerrymandering, you get to a situation as in Ohio, where Democrats in 2016 won 40% of the congressional vote, but only 25% of the seats. Or in Maryland, where Republicans won 36% of the vote, but only 12.5%, that is one of the 8 congressional seats. This is not a fair way of doing business. Eliminating partisan gerrymandering would help in this regard, but there's a more radical idea out there. It's called the Fair Representation Act. And this would do something that's very familiar in Europe and very alien to the United States. It would introduce proportional representation in multi-member districts for the House of Representatives. So any state that had at least 6 members of the House of Representatives would be divided into multi-member districts of 3 to 5 members each, depending on the size of the state. And then each party would get a share of the seats proportionate to share of the vote. So if Republicans won 30% of the seats in a Maryland 3-member district, instead of getting maybe no seats, they'd get 1 seat, and vice versa, maybe in Alabama or something like that. I don't think this has a chance of going anywhere anytime soon, but it's another interesting idea. It would make elections more representative and inclusive. We know that ranked choice voting is very favorable to the inclusion of women and minorities in parliaments. It would reduce the underrepresentation of one party or another in certain states, would reduce the influence of gerrymandering, would probably increase voter turnout by making people's votes count more. The arguments against it are, well, the bigger the district, the easier it is for maybe a third or fourth or fifth party to get elected. If you have a 5-seat district, you only have to win 1/6 of the vote plus one to get elected to Congress. And in one sense, that's good. You start seeing maybe more parties get elected that would be more representative of America. But in some parts of the country, you might see a member of the Ku Klux Klan elected to the United States Congress as well. I'll let you debate on that one. So how can we get reform? Well, as I suggested, it's not going to happen in terms of electoral reform by action of the US Congress. It's going to happen at the state level, usually by referendum. Fortunately, the referendum to adopt ranked choice voting won in Alaska, but it lost in Massachusetts this year, and pretty decisively, unfortunately. We thought we were going to win that one. It's been adopted in many cities, including New York in 2019, and a number of smaller cities, including one of my favorite cities in California, Eureka, in just this past November. We've had other reforms that have been adopted at the state level, including reforms to eliminate partisan gerrymandering and give the ability to draw electoral district boundaries to independent, nonpartisan commissions, which has now been done recently in several states in 2018, and in Virginia again in 2020. Automatic voter registration has been adopted. Maine in 2016 and 2018 adopted ranked choice voting. So the voter referendum or the voter initiatives gives us an opportunity to put the power to reform our democracy in the hands of the electorate and takes it out of the hands of the parties. I told you about the Virginia initiative in November to eliminate gerrymandering. Oregon just adopted a very interesting campaign finance reform this past November that gets rid of dark money, that limits campaign contributions, and that requires that political ads disclose who paid for them. And that passed with 78% support. There's more we can do to increase voter participation, which reached, as you know, record levels this year. I personally think it wasn't just because of the stakes in the election. Voting became easier because people could do it from their house, or people could go in many states and counties anytime within a 1 week or 2 week period to cast their ballot. And so, of course, more people voted. So what's the lesson of the ironic lesson of this COVID era? Make voting easier and more people will do it. So why wouldn't we want to institutionalize that and maybe even do what Oregon, Hawaii, or Washington, and the state of Utah, not the last time I checked, a liberal democratic state, have done, and vote entirely by mail. And I would move primary elections closer to the general election, maybe after Labor Day. I think you're all pretty well informed, and so you do know that the Supreme Court has ruled in a way that treats campaign spending as equivalent to free speech, and it makes it very hard to regulate the campaign spending of individuals and of political action committees. But at least we could end political secrecy for these political action committees by requiring them to reveal their real donors. We could end the loophole in the tax law that gives a 501c4 the ability to spend tax deductible money on a political campaign, so long as they spend 50.01% of their total funds on educational activities, which are often political issue-based advocacy. I would actually increase the limits on campaign contributions for individuals, but effectively the limits on campaign contributions have been shot through to triviality by the way the system has evolved. We made a lot of progress, and you can thank our professor in the law school, Nate Persily, and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project for some heroic efforts here to improve election security and integrity. And of course, you can count the man who Donald Trump just fired for doing the job in terms of the Federal Infrastructure Center for Infrastructure Security too well, Chris Krebs. But we did improve the security of our election infrastructure. We modernized many voting machines. There's much more we could do in that regard. If you saw Chris Krebs's interview on 60 Minutes last Sunday, if you haven't, you got to watch it. You'll see that we dramatically increased the percentage of voting machines in the United States. I think it's now well over 80% that leave an auditable paper trail, but we need to get that up to 100%. And I would say we just need stronger federal standards for election machines, for transparency in the process, and for the handling of mail-in ballots. Why should we have this crazy system where Pennsylvania, restricts the ability to count mail-in ballots in advance of the election, and Florida does it right away, and so can give you an answer on who won the election that night? I am coming to a couple of other issues, and then I'm going to close. One has to do with the Congress. There's so much we can do to take the power to block compromise away from party leaders pursuing maximalist and rejectionist agendas, and give it to party caucuses that might be willing to lean more in a compromising direction. I would allow members of any party to offer amendments to any House or frankly Senate bill, and try and get those amendments to a vote on the floor. Certainly empower the ranking minority members of House and Senate committees to bring a bill forward to the floor, and not allow the Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader to block it. As you can see, as part of the deal that restored her to the speakership 2 years ago, Nancy Pelosi did agree to some reforms that you see at bottom here that did allow slightly more ability for the House caucuses to navigate around leadership obstruction and bring bills to the floor or bring amendments to the floor. I would also require Senate consideration of judicial and executive appointments within a certain time period. If the opposition party controls the Senate, I would have a rule that if it doesn't bring an appointment to the floor within 3 months or 4 months or something, that appointment is just automatically approved. And if you want to have a debate on why I favor eliminating the Senate filibuster, I welcome it. I know we all have an opinion on this highly controversial provision that didn't used to have the consequence that it now does for legislation, but now has de facto put us in a situation where we need to get 60 members of an already not very representative body in terms of the geographic distribution to agree on something in order to pass any legislation. I would eliminate it. I'm going to close with the Supreme Court. I saved the best for last. This is just chance, you know, it's the way the cookie crumbles. Remember your mother telling you when you didn't get, maybe on the team that you wanted to be selected in soccer and school or something, life is unfair. Well, life has been very fair to Republicans and very unfair to Democrats, not because of any intrinsic rigging of the system, but just by the accident of death and timing and retirement, that we now have 6 of the 9 justices appointed by Republicans. And increasingly, we have a phenomenon which is only possible in the United States of America among liberal democracies of the world, where someone could be on the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court of the United States, for 40 years, because we don't have age limits on justices, which many of our peer democracies like Germany and Canada do. We don't have term limits for Supreme Court justices. And increasingly, to pursue the vanity of trying to shape the Supreme Court as deep into the future as possible, presidents are choosing younger and younger nominees so they actually might be on the court for 40 years. And that has produced the phenomenon where Republicans and Democrats have controlled the White House for about the same number of years since 1976. But 11 justices have been appointed by Republicans and 4 by Democrats. And it's become a very existential struggle. Well, our own Ro Khanna of the Silicon Valley, a member of the House of Representatives, has introduced a bill, the concept of which has been endorsed by many other thinkers and advocates, including The Economist magazine, that would introduce 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. And the idea is that every president would get a chance to nominate a justice in the first and third year of her term. And with each 4 years, you would nominate 2 justices. After 18 years, you would have 9, and then you would cycle through and start the process over again. This would avoid election year fights by doing it in the first and third year. It would reduce the arbitrariness and unfairness of the system that I have identified to you in the previous slide. And by fixing the terms at 18 years, it wouldn't be such an existential struggle. If you don't like that person, well, there's a good chance you'll see someone else take that Supreme Court seat, in a time that's long on the horizon, but not invisible on the horizon. So with that, I'm going to end my screen sharing and take all your questions and comments and divergent opinions. So let's go, to the chat room. And now I guess I've got to answer these questions. What do I think about? So some of them, I'm just going to have to go in order. How can I do it any other way? What do I think about the Lincoln Project? Well, I don't want to make a partisan statement here by, saying who I favored for the presidential election, because I'm sure it's still a mystery to most people. But I will say these Republicans who decided they were going to, that the incumbent Republican had defected from democratic norms, and they were going to do everything they could to support the Democratic alternative. I admire their principle and being willing to support the other party, even though they disagreed with many of the candidates' positions on the issues, out of higher principle for democracy. And I think that unequivocally, in my opinion, this is not a partisan statement, I think they had the best political ads of the 2020 election cycle. Sorry about my tardiness in getting into presentation mode. Um, uh, so reforming the Electoral College now, this is a very interesting uh, uh, dilemma that we face. One participant in here is asking if we should add a rule that you have to win a majority of the vote in a majority of states. I, favor a reform. I favor simplicity in reform whenever possible. And so if you have to win a majority in a majority of states, it raises the problem, which other states have struggled with, other countries have struggled with, of what happens if nobody wins a majority in a majority of states. And I certainly don't want it resolved as a tie vote or a lack of majority in the Electoral College is now resolved by the extremely perverse method of having the House of Representatives vote not by even by membership, but by state delegation, which, if you want me to elaborate on, I will. We came very close to in the year 2020. If 40,000 votes had changed in 3 states, it would have been a 269 tie, and the House of Representatives would have elected Donald Trump through voting by state delegation on January 6th. Look, I favor, as my first preference, a constitutional amendment to simply implement the national popular vote. As my second preference, the national popular vote interstate compact, which has been adopted by states that account for about 185 electoral votes, something like that. And the agreement is that each state passes an identical law that says, we mandate that our electoral votes will go to the candidate who wins a majority, who gets the most votes in the national popular vote. And this law will go into effect when states that account for 270 electoral votes have all adopted a similar law. Now, the problem is, how long is it going to take for states to adopt this law? Number one, getting to 270 may be a long time in coming. But number two, there's not consensus on whether the Supreme Court would judge this to be constitutional. And so if it's not constitutional, then you're in an election crisis when states thought they were pursuing one law and then another law prevails. So I think the best method is something that we can all agree on. And one idea that Larry Lessig has proposed that might be slightly more palatable to smaller states would keep the Electoral College, keep the overrepresentation of small states like Rhode Island, South Dakota, and Wyoming, but then distribute the electoral votes of each state proportionately. So if a Democrat wins 30% of the vote in Wyoming, they would get 30% of Wyoming's 3 electoral votes. If a Republican gets 41% of California's, I think, 55 or so electoral votes, the Republican would get 41% of the 55 electoral votes. And you would distribute it proportionately. It would be closer to the national popular vote, but it would slightly overrepresent the influence of smaller states. So some have asked, might that compromise be a way of reducing the possibility that the loser of the popular vote might become president? I don't know. We can see. Someone says, yes, it's an immediate reaction. Ranked choice voting seems a bit gimmicky to me. There could be a lot of unintended and unanticipated negative consequences. Well, the principal consequence that some people don't like is not unintended or unanticipated. It may be simply something that people dislike, and that is that someone might win an election who wasn't leading on the first round preferences, and that happened in Maine in 2018 when a member of Congress was elected after slightly trailing in the first preference votes, but being able to win more of the votes of the two independent candidates. So, my feeling about ranked choice voting is we're not going to get a law to adopt it nationally. Let's try it at the state level and see how it works and see how voters feel about it. Most voters at the municipal level who've tried ranked choice voting come to like it. They like the civility of the campaigns. They like the greater choice that it gives them. They like the ability of more candidates to surface and make their case. And so I think it's an option whose time is coming. It's true, someone said that the sore loser rule prevents some of the spoiler effect, but I think only some of the spoiler effect as as you get into a phenomenon where one candidate can win with only 35 or even 40% of the vote, it does create a perverse situation where an independent who didn't run in a primary, who just runs in a general election, but who people regard as an appealing candidate, might fade because they're seen as a spoiler, but might actually be the one who emerges with the majority of the vote if they had a chance to make their case. I'll be honest in saying, I'd like to see some true independents get elected to Congress and enlarge the middle ground around which and from which compromises might be forged. There's an argument that this would benefit the Democratic Party. I don't think that's true. I think there are a number of states, Alaska's one, where it might actually benefit Republicans. If they can figure out football or college basketball ranks or brackets, they will understand 4 rounds of voting. I love that comment. Thank you very much for it. Ranked voting exists in European presidential parliamentary elections. Everybody understands it and it works fine. Well, you have proportional representation very commonly in Europe. Ranked voting is used in a few European elections. The most prominent use of ranked choice voting in single member districts for parliament is our sister democracy of Australia, which has been using what they call the preferential vote, but it's the same thing. It's the instant runoff or ranked choice voting. And Australia has been using it for over a century now, and they seem to like it just fine. Let's try keep going through here. The parties try to keep third candidates from winning primaries. They want to pick the candidates. Look, I kind of struggle over this, and I'm not of one mind. I think there's a case for party primaries. Parties, first of all, I think are very important phenomena in a democracy, and they help to organize our choices. They help to mobilize voters. They nominate candidates for election for president, certainly. They've been nominating candidates for all other offices for a long time. And there's something in me as a political scientist and in a way also as a libertarian, someone with some libertarian impulses, that worries about undermining political parties and about denying political parties the right to choose their candidate by whatever means they wish. And so by that logic, you would say, okay, let's just have party primaries. Let's move the primaries closer to the general elections so more people will vote in them. So I would do it in the first week or two of September, maybe make it a week-long exercise. And then let's eliminate the sore loser rule. If someone doesn't win in a primary and wants to run as an independent, they can't have the label Democrat or R Republican after their name on the ballot, but if they wanted to stand as an independent, they could do so. And then use ranked choice voting. That's kind of the system I lean to, but I'd like to see a lot of options tried at the state level and see how they work and how people like them. So make in-person voting happen on a Sunday, like many countries in Europe. You know, I used to be a big advocate of moving election day to a Saturday, a Sunday, or a holiday. One of my colleagues in political science, Adam Bonica, had a great editorial in the New York Times, I think maybe around 2016, where he said, look, President's Day or Veterans Day, you know, we could move it to any day of the year. So why not make President's Day on Election Day and make it a holiday? But I think COVID has plunged us into a better solution. And the better solution is to create a period of time, a couple weeks before the election, where people, as they begin to make their decisions, can decide how they want to vote. They can go to voting stations at any time in a week or 2-week period and vote at a few designated voting stations. They can get a mail-in ballot and drop it off at a convenient local counting center. They can mail the ballot in. If you want a rule that it's got to be mailed in and received by election day, I'm actually okay with it as long as you advertise it well in advance. Or they can vote on election day. If you've got these multiple options, it doesn't matter so much when election day is. So let's see what else. Many can't help but notice that there seems to be a disposition between personal effort and ethics in rallies and the amount of votes obtained for Joe Biden and in comparison to Hillary and Obama. You know, I think that I think the single most important reason why so many more people voted, and it's a record, 2/3 of eligible voters voted this year. We haven't seen this in 120 years. So why did so many more people vote this year than in past elections? I don't think it was because of the fear that Donald Trump was going to be an authoritarian ruler if he was reelected, or the fear that Joe Biden was a closet socialist if he was elected. I think that motivated a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans, but I don't think it was necessarily more motivating than the intense motivation, for example, that people felt to vote for Obama in 2008, or maybe vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980 or something like that. I really believe the vast disconnect between the turnout this year and turnout in previous elections was that voting became dramatically easier in 2020, perversely because of the pandemic and the expansion of mail-in voting and the expansion of early voting, because we were worried about people standing in line, having to vote. So if we have stumbled into this experiment where we wondered how could we increase voter turnout, and we found, lo and behold, the answer is to make voting dramatically easier. Let's do it again. And let's institutionalize it. And if you want to institutionalize means to verify signatures, fine, let's do it. If you want to institutionalize means to audit the vote, I'm strongly in favor of that as well. There is an argument here, which has been a prominent one now in legal and political science debates, that we've been veering too much toward executive action. And, with the decree power or executive decision power and so on. And how might we revive Congress as a more consequential actor? And my answer is very simple. You've got to make it possible for Congress to decide things. And I think that there are two primary ways of doing that. One is to reduce political polarization in the Congress through electoral reform, particularly ranked choice voting. The second one is to make it easier for Congress to decide things. And that's why I went through all of those mechanisms that would reduce the ability of congressional leaders, Republican and Democratic leaders, to stop legislation from even coming to the floor, and empower centrist coalitions like the one we have right now on the relief bill to bring measures to the floor, even if the speaker and the Senate majority leader don't like them and feel that they want something more. Let the Congress vote. If they don't like a reasonable compromise, they can vote it down. If they don't like a presidential nominee for a cabinet post or a judgeship, they can vote it down. But this business of obstruction, I think we've got to end. And that's why I also favor getting rid of the Senate filibuster. I just think that there was a time when it was a very rare mechanism that it was used on only something that a senator regarded as purely existential. And now it's just become an instant reflex. And I think it is degrading the quality of our democracy. Someone asked about randomly assigning people to where they sit in the Congress so that Republicans and Democrats, God forbid, would actually have to sit next to one another. I don't think this is going to have a huge impact. I like the idea anyway, or I think it's kind of intriguing. I think there are some other things we could do that might be more consequential. Let me mention one. Right now, it used to be the case that members of Congress spent a lot of time in Washington. They actually moved their families to Washington. They dined with one another socially, drank with one another socially, across party lines. They built cross-cutting ties of dialogue and even friendship that facilitated bipartisanship in legislation and in approving appointments and so on and so forth. And that's all gone now. They arrive on Tuesday morning or Monday night. They're there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then they fly back to their district. A proposal that I think is really worth considering would have Congress in session Monday to Friday, 3 weeks a month, and then they'd fly home for the fourth week every month. So they'd get more intensive interaction with their district once a month. They wouldn't be bouncing around like yo-yos all the time. And they'd have more meaningful interaction with one another during the 3-week period. I might add that if we could change campaign finance somehow so they weren't spending staggering, obscene, depressing amounts of time across the street from Capitol Hill in rented office basements, simply making phone calls 18 months a year, asking people for money to fund their reelection campaign, they'd have more time to get to know one another and do the people's business. And this is one reason, beyond influence and inappropriate influence and the undemocraticness of it, why I feel we so desperately need public financing of campaigns, or at least partial public financing, because it's so depressing how much time they have to spend raising money. I think we're probably getting toward the time when Linda wants us to wrap up, but I want to say a couple things in conclusion. The first thing is that I do believe we've gotten to a kind of perilous and worrisome point with our democracy in terms of polarization, disinformation, zero-sum politics, intolerance, unwillingness to listen. But I think also the momentum for reform is gathering. And I think it's a time when grassroots mobilization, both at the state level and in terms of organizations, can do a lot of good. And so the organization that came up with the idea of members sitting with one another is called No Labels. And the idea is, let's get rid of the R&D and just have members of Congress talking to one another as representatives of the people. That's an organization I would recommend to you. Another, which has been pushing a lot of these ballot initiatives at the state level to bring about reform, to end gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, transparency, electoral reform, is Represent Us. And if you just Google www.represent.us.org or something like that, you'll get to the organization. It's doing a lot of creative work. And there's so many now organizations that are the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the Brennan Center for Justice, the Lincoln Project, and others that are working on political reform. And many of them are Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals coming together, asking the simple question of how can we make our politics more cooperative again, not take the principle or the ideological agenda out of it, but make it more yielding to compromise. And how can we make Congress functional again? And so I think it's an exciting time for our democracy, because I think there are a lot of very viable reform ideas on the agenda.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, everyone, we've got so much to think about now. Thank all of you for your thoughtful questions, Larry for so much good information and advice. So I wish all of you good health and a good evening, and thanks very much for coming to this event.
Bye-bye.